So the title of this research, or this working kind of developing research, is Students of the Street. I gave it this name because I talk specifically about student movements. So my study encompasses 4 student movements in Bangladesh between 2015 and 2024. So in today's presentation, I'm mostly going to focus on 2 movements. Those are the 2018 road safety movement and the 2024 July Uprising. And the previous 2 movements will just be talked about, just to give you some background and some very brief comparisons. But the main target of discussion is the 2018 road safety movement and the 2024 July Uprising. So I have given you a summary of the initial causes of all these movements, their durations, the longest being 152 days for the 2018 quota reform movement, and the shortest being the road safety movement, also in 2018, that lasted for only 13 days. Some of the movements had a leading organization, a social movement organization. So only one of them did not. The road safety movement did not really have an organization to lead the movement. It didn't really have a steering body. So it was kind of like an amorphous, spontaneous protest that started from 2 school children being killed on the streets of Dhaka. And the No Ban on Education movement started when the government imposed a value-added tax on the tuition fees of private university students. They wanted it reversed. They had an 85 days long protest campaign against it. There were some leading organizations. They did some processions and blockade, and they got their demand. The VAT was withdrawn. The quota reform movement happened twice, in 2018 once, and then in 2024. During the 2018 movement, the first quota reform movement was about reforming the quota system in public jobs, which had 30% of it reserved for the progenies of freedom fighters who fought in the 1971 Bangladesh Liberation War. This was seen as massively corrupt because there were many fake certificates given out by the ruling party to their supporters and followers and their activists. And people thought it was unfair that such a huge portion of the government jobs would be given to these people. So there were protests about it, there were processions, road blockades, and the quota was finally abolished back in 2018 by the Prime Minister when she said that this would be abolished in the parliament. So this was scaled back. This was the government, or the courts actually declared this illegal in 2024, leading to initial protests about changing the court's decision, like reversing the decision to basically reverse the previous decision, which was taken in 2018. And they did not want the quota to be brought back. They wanted the quota to not be there. So it was kind of a continuation of the legacy of 2018 quota reform movement, but it quickly turned into an anti-government movement for regime change. There were mass demonstrations, blockades, roadblocks, strikes, digital campaign, graffiti, and occupations, and they used a very varied set of repertoires, and it caused the fall of the Sheikh Hasina regime, which was a pretty authoritarian regime, it has also been described as a hybrid regime, and the July Uprising caused the end of that regime. So we'll be talking about the last 2 movements. The first 2 movements are there just for a reference frame. All right. So I have used mixed methods for this research. I have used quantitative and qualitative, both types of analysis here. For the qualitative data, I've mostly used semi-structured interviews, although I plan to do an ethnography later when I do my field work, maybe a year from now. So for the semi-structured interviews, I start with key informant interviews, so just interviewing people who were in the leading positions, leading the road safety movement, and then I chose more people through snowball sampling, so I got names of more people who I could interview through the previous people, and that's how the interviews progressed. And for the quantitative side, for the interviews, I did around 15 interviews in total for the road safety movement. And for the quantitative side, I did a survey of the road safety movement participants, First, I called on my Facebook friends and followers to fill up the survey, and then they sent it to other people they know, so also snowballing through that. And for the July uprising data, I have done some analysis from ACLED. ACLED is it's basically armed conflict location event data. So it's pretty. I found it to be somewhat reliable, and I've used it to create a regression between repression and protest. Repression being expressed as number of deaths each day of the protest. So the deaths are standing as a proxy of repression, and protest events, event count of protest, how many protest events happen each day, would be the proxy of protest, basically. So we're going to talk more about that later. So first, let me just set the scene of how these two movements got to be so big. I think the role of humiliation and indignation played a pretty key role. So the 2018 movement, this person was a ruling party minister. He was a shipping minister, and he made a derogatory comment about a movement that was forming among the school children after the death of the two children in the streets. So he made a derogatory comment. He kind of belittled the movement. He said that there shouldn't be any movement about it because road accidents are very regular events. So that kind of indignated the students. So one of the interview 10 said that this is the only reason I think the movement became so big, or movement happened. So and then a journalist describes the misstep of Hasina, then Prime Minister of Bangladesh. She called the protesters of the July uprising progenies of Rajakars. Rajakar means wartime collaborators with the Pakistani army who were Bengali, but they collaborated with the Pakistani army to carry out genocide and rape and arson and various wartime crimes. So that humiliation and indignation backfired on the regime and made the movement stronger. So I wanted to give you a brief understanding of that. And then let's talk about the road safety movement. What was the This is the basic demographics. So the age of the people of the road safety movement mostly were between 16 to 20 and 21 to 25. The majority of them are very young, with 16 to 20 being a large percentage. And then the economic class seems to be mostly lower middle class and middle class. So lower middle class, middle class were the highest participants, and 71% of them described themselves as politically independent. This hints at the development of a third force that I've called third force in one of my previous papers published in 2018. It's called Shahbag Stolen question mark. It was published in South Asia Research, where I argued that there's a third force in Bangladesh that's politically independent. It has its own voice, it has its own demands, it has its own aspirations, and that third force is basically this part, the 71% people. These people participated in the movement, and I would argue that these people also participated in the July uprising, although later they demobilized, and only the politically active factions of the July uprising are still in action, and they have built a new political party. But this 71% is a key group of people who must be given attention to. So for the next slide, we look at the activist class. Jasper 1998 described that some sort of activist class developed through participation in protests. So I would like to say that in the road safety movement, when I did the survey, I found that most students participated in some sort of a social movement before. So only 36% said they didn't ever participate in any movement. But 54%, or no, 64%, yeah. Sorry for delaying calculation. 64% people said that they participated in some sort of social movement before, be it the Shahbag movement, the No VAT on Education movement, quota reform movement, or any other movement. So it seems that the same people kept recurring in various movements. So there's a development of an activist class that's going on, and I'm going to do the same survey for the July uprising as well, and I can speculate that I would find a similar result, that most of the people who participated in the July uprising also participated in previous movements. So I'm planning to create a new typology of social movements. So it might not be entirely new, but I'm kind of framing it as a typology of movements based on the motivations that start the movement. So firstly, I made the first box, which is called the interest-driven movement. So some of these movements are movements where the constituency wants to advance their interest in some way. So, for example, the no VAT movement is an interest-driven movement. They want to cancel the VAT on their tuition fees. The quota reform movement is an interest-driven movement because they want to broaden their scope of getting into public jobs. However, the road safety movement is an emotion-driven movement. It is an outburst. It's a spontaneous outburst that is not really organized. They don't really want anything concrete for themselves. They just want safer streets. Whatever that might mean, they don't know, but they're angered, they're indignated, they're humiliated, and they're acting out of their emotion. So this is emotion-driven movement. However, I argue that interest-driven movements and emotion-driven movements both have their advantages and disadvantages. So if it's even the movement which is most successful, most powerful, is a mixed movement, which is the July Uprising, which has an interest-driven aspect as well as an emotion-driven aspect. I say that because in the interest-driven aspect of July Uprising is the let's get rid of the quota again. The people who wanted to get rid of the quota are the core constituency of this movement. But there was emotion attached to as well. The emotion was students are being killed, we need to get down on the streets. So having both the interest aspect of it and the emotion aspect of it made the movement, they took the movement at the strongest position that we have seen after the July-August period in Bangladesh. So I argue that mixed movements are the most successful. So it's, if a movement wants to be successful, it has to have an interest-driven aspect to it and an emotion-driven aspect to it. However, solely interest-driven and solely emotion-driven movements can be successful as well. But if you don't have an interest, when there's repression, like there was on the road safety movement, there is a chance that your movement might demobilize. Okay, so this is another idea that I'm developing. It's called cumulative learning. I kind of argue that movements learn from each other, especially when they take place in close temporal proximity. They share demographics, and if the same personnel are basically participating in all of these movements, they learn from each other. And with each movement, if they have the same kind of orientation politically, they tend to learn from each other, and each subsequent movement becomes more powerful than the previous movement. So the quota reform movement learned from the no VAT movement. So the no VAT movement was single issue, get rid of the VATs, and it was a limited constituency movement. It was just about private university students. Learning from that, the quota reform movement was still a single issue movement. It was about getting rid of the quota system, but it had an expanded constituency. So not just private university students, but also public university students and also the unemployed youth. So it had a broader constituency. So, and then learning from all of those, both the no VAT education and the quota reform movement, the road safety movement had a broader issue. It bridged various frames, not having proper licensing on the streets, not having laws being applied to everyone equally, there not being justice in the society. They had a broader issue, but their constituency was limited to only school children or college students. Basically, students and children were the core constituency. Learning from all of these, the July Uprising had a broader issue, so a total systematic change was their demand, and they had an expanded constituency that included all of the most of the people in Bangladesh, or like a large number of people in Bangladesh, including students, workers, middle class, upper middle class, and even the upper class. So this movement became so powerful because it had a broader issue and b a broader expanded constituency. So why did the road safety movement demobilize? It was because of the heavy-handed repression by police and ruling party. They injured more than 100 students in a span of 13 days. There was no transformative event, so no student had died in the movement, for example. So one of the transformative events that I'll talk about in the July Uprising was the death of a student, Abu Said, that led to a backfire to the repression and made the movement even stronger. So there was no such transformative event. No student had died in the road safety movement. one could speculate that had a child died because of the repression by the police and the political goons, then the movement might have looked different. I'm not saying that it would be good if a child had died, but I'm just speculating that if there was a death of a child, then the movement could have taken a different form, and that could have acted as a transformative event. And there was a lack of social movement organization. There was no organizational backbone that could steer the movement. So when it faced repression, it just demobilized. Okay, but why did the July uprising? Why did it not demobilize on the face of repression? What was so special about July uprising? So Tilly says that the relationship between repression and protest is curvilinear, so it's like inverted U. So it's lower on the both of the lowest amount of repression and highest amount of repression. But with repression, you would see that movements would demobilize, right? But that happens in the road safety movement, but not in the July uprising. Why is that? I argue it's because of those transformative events, which are crucial turning points that dramatically increase or decrease the rates of mobilization, according to Hess and Martin 2006. So these are the green dots. The green dots represent transformative event. Right here you can see, right here is the death of Abu Said. Right after that, there's a spike in protest activity, and these are more deaths, and then there's a spike in protest activity. So you can see that just from looking at the relationship between the blue line, which is the total events, and the red line, the total fatalities, you can see that there is a relationship between the transformative events and the spikes in the protest activities. So, and then also, these are the transformative events that I have kind of expanded upon in my paper. So, first, Hasina calling the protesters progenies of war criminals, basically, was the first transformative event that made the movement so strong. The killing of Abu Said, the student, was also caused backfire. When Hasina asked people to turn their profile picture black, people instead did change it to red. That was also a transformative event. And also, counterintuitively, the shutting down of internet might have had a positive effect on the movement, because then students could not really do slacktivism, or people could not just put a post up on Facebook and be done with it. They actually had to come down to the streets. A and B, the pro-government propaganda machineries were inactive because they could not spin the movement into a negative position and malign it because there was no internet at all. So these are some of the transformative events that I talk about. And then I'll show you now the data analysis that I've done for this paper. So before that, a note on data. We've used the accolade data between June 5th and August 5th, 2024, so 60 days. Covers protest-related fatalities and number of protest events. So main relationship will be shown between only protest-related fatalities, so no assassinations or any other deaths that are related to those time periods, but just protest-related fatalities and number of protest events each day. We have adjusted using the 2023 population estimates. So we have created a date division grid using 8 divisions. So there are 8 administrative units in Bangladesh called divisions. So we created a date division grid using those 8 divisions. We have used lag features to capture temporal effects. So we have also captured the spillover analysis of protest events and fatalities. We use a square root transformation because some of the data points were very anomalous, so they were very far off the usual other data points. So we used a square root transformation. But there might be some limitations and biases. So first of all, there is an underreporting risk. So media censorship. So Accolade collects data from media sources, right? And media sources are heavily censored, were at least heavily censored under Hasina regime, and there's government suppression of the media sources. So, for example, Accolade shows 575 deaths, right? But the UN has estimated there have been 1,400 deaths. These news might have not reached the media, or they might not have reported it from fear of repression. They might have underreported them. But the government reports 834 deaths, which is kind of closer to the Accolade data, but Accolade data is still kind of the best data we have on this, so I'm going to use that anyway. And we exclude non-lethal repression, so mass arrest, curfews, we do not count them. So these are some limitations of the data. So this is the regression model we use. So we're basically looking at the relationship between events on a given day, on a given division, and the relationship between that and the number of fatalities the day before on that division, and then the number of fatalities the day before in the other divisions, and then number of events the day before in that division, and then in other divisions. The B5T is basically the time trend to show the temporal patterns, and this is B6 is added with the population of that division to see if the population has any effect on it. So the result we get is this. So the fatalities of the day before that division gives us a significant, really positive relationship between local fatalities and mobilization. So more local fatalities increases mobilization, and the coefficient is 0.16. Fatalities the day before elsewhere is not significant, so you could interpret it as a slight reduction, but it is so less that we cannot really determine the relationship between them. And then events day before on that division is significant, so past events predict future events, which kind of follow the feedback loop model proposed by Biggs before. And then events day before elsewhere, that's the strongest predictor. So events in other divisions matter more. So if more protests are happening in other divisions, more protests will happen in this division as well. So the temporal pattern is not significant, and population effect is not significant as well. So these are the R squared, mean absolute error, RMSE, multicollinearity, and residual distribution. So the model has moderate explanatory power. We have a relatively small mean absolute error. There are some large outliers, so we have a 0.753 root mean squared error. There is no severe multicollinearity issues, so reliable coefficient estimates. Residual distribution is normal, random, so model is well fitted. There is not significant overfitting or underfitting in the model. So this is the negative binomial regression and OLS regression between events and events, lagged events and events, and lagged fatalities and current events. So this is the relationship we see between lagged fatalities and current events. This looks like a curved, upward curve. And the relationship between lagged events and current events is just a positive relationship that we see between previous events and current events. This is an OLS regression, and this is a negative binomial regression. So the framing task, I would say that all of these movements did some framing tasks, but the July Uprising did the most impressive framing task. It bridged the frame between its original initial cause, which was to get rid of the quota system, go back to the 2018 declaration, but it very quickly evolved into something that is much larger. It evolved into a movement for justice. It evolved into a movement for greater accountability, and it moved to a movement for regime change. That happened because they bridged their frames with other existing grievances in society. They amplified their frame, they extended their frame, and they transformed their frame. They did all of this. Road safety movement, on the other hand, transformed their frames and somewhat bridged their frames to other demands. That's why the "We Want Justice" slogan became so resonant. The quota reform movement only extended their frames to a limited extent towards other movements that existed. The No Ban on Education only did frame amplification. So you can see the way the framing tasks have evolved over all of these movements. You can see more framing tasks are being done as the movements are progressing. So that is another evidence of cumulative learning, I would argue. So final point is about social movement organizations. This is one of the most important takeaways from this study so far, which is if there is no social movement organization, the movement is much less likely to succeed. So one of the main puzzles that I've explored in this research is the relationship between repression and protests. So in the 2018 road safety movement, there was repression, but there was the movement demobilized. In the July uprising, there was repression, but the movement got stronger. So at the point in the July uprising, a group of leaders from the movement were picked up and they're coerced into giving a statement that would end the movement. But other leaders came up to the forefront and said they declined this. They'd resist this and they would continue the movement anyway. So there were other movements from the social movement organizations that could come up and take the leadership. This was not present in the road safety movement. That's why when the government staged a few students to come to the media and say we called the protests off, the movement was kind of demobilized. But that was not they were not able to do that for the July uprising. So social movement organization is really important. And I'm in my PhD dissertation, or thesis, I'm actually going to explore how this social movement organization actually took hold between the period of 2018 and 2024. And that is what I call latent repoliticization, or covert repoliticization. And that activity has made the social movement organization so strong that it could withstand incredible repression. And that is, I believe, all that I have for my presentation today. These are my references, and I welcome all of your thoughts, comments, and questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay. Yeah, no, I thought this was great. I had a couple of thoughts as well as questions. Partly, I was thinking about your distinction between interest-driven movements and emotion-driven movements. And I don't know if you sort of refer explicitly to the work of Wendy Perlman there, which I think, I'm not sure I'm convinced that there is such a thing as collective emotions, as she is arguing. In the context of the Arab Spring. But I do think it's a very important mechanism, and I'm wondering if that might be a more useful way for you to frame this as well as sort of a mechanism that is at play in some of the movements and not in others, rather than as sort of a way of framing the movement overall. I'm not sure I would buy that there's such a thing as a movement that's entirely emotion-driven or entirely interest-driven. It sounds a little bit like maybe one of the movements don't follow their own interest, and I think everyone have an interest in road safety if you live in on conditions where road safety is not there. But I do think sort of highlighting this as mechanisms is really interesting. And then I think if you add that as mechanisms, that adds more to your analysis of which ones are most successful and why. And the other thing I was wondering about, and this is more of a question than a comment, is that you're framing how issues and how constituencies change from one movement to the next. What I thought was quite interesting in one of your first slides was it looks like repertoires also developed, that there's something in the road safety movement that you don't really see in the other ones, in terms of they had roadblocks and had processions in the earlier ones. But as someone who works in rebel governance, it looked like there was almost an element of governance by the protesters in checking driver's licenses and sort of like conducting the essential functions of the state. And I'm just wondering, is there something that's really ever been seen before? And is that something you're going into more detail with? So I'm more questions if you want them later, but I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Larson. Very quickly, could you repeat the name of the paper you mentioned about the movement types and mechanisms?
I think it's one of the Wendy Perlman papers. I think you've talking about.
Wendy Perlman.
Perlman, yeah. She looks at Syria during the Arab Spring.
Right. So your questions, yeah, definitely. The repertoires definitely developed throughout the movements, and the road safety movement was a really unique case because the repertoires of that movement were really innovative, and in a way they were showing the failures of the state by doing the task of the state better than the state. So that was a way of them to ridicule the state actually. and they forced the police to enforce traffic laws. For the first time, they enacted or they maintained a separate lane for emergency vehicles. So these type of repertoires were really powerful. And then, however, this was carried out in the July uprising as well. The repertoires were more like they used innovative repertoires as well. For example, they called their strikes Bangla blockade. For example, they gave some very catchy names. But however, the main modality of the repertoires are pretty similar, like processions, blockades, strikes, occupations. These have been used before, but I think in terms of in terms of the amount of being innovative, the road safety movement was probably the most innovative movement in recent history of Bangladesh, especially because it was done by a very unlikely group of protesters who would not usually participate in protests by themselves before the road safety movement. It was led by the school children. So they were able to do some things that usual activists would not do. But yeah, I think the point is well taken that doing some sort of mock governance was used as a powerful tool to kind of protest without turning it into a violent activity or anything like that.
Okay, I might jump in with also a few questions and comments. Firstly, let me say, I mean, this is very interesting, and I think that Bangladesh in general, at least sort of from what I've read and seen, is sort of a case study that isn't really looked at, and so I think this is really cool that they're looking at it, and certainly also looking at like the 2024 July movement is really cool. In terms of sort of my comments and questions, kind of echoing Rune's point here, when I was looking at your initial table where you compare all these different movements, it seems to be the case that there are innovations in terms of the repertoires that the people are using, sort of from the initial two to the 2018 road safety movement, and then sort of a whole bunch of new things enter into 2024. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, like, do you have a sense of why that might be? Because to me, that's really interesting. I think it's Tilly who makes the point that, like, in general, innovations in repertoire don't happen that often, mm-hmm. and that when they do, sort of, protesters seem to sort of stick with the ones that they sort of innovate to. So if we think about the Arab Spring, it's like this sort of marching to central squares after Friday prayers was this big innovation that then sort of movements since have then tried to keep doing. And so to me, it might be very interesting also to look at like why we get these shifts. And I think what is also really interesting is like, why is it that only the 2024 movement utilizes a sort of online campaign? Is it sort of not there in the previous ones? And if so, why, for example? So that might be my first question.
All of these are network movements.
Okay.
So all of these use social media.
Okay.
So like these are all youth movements. Everyone is on Facebook. There are events on Facebook. There are WhatsApp group chats. So all of these are network youth movements. So maybe that was not clear from my initial presentation. But all of these movements use online digital campaigns. So I should probably add them to the other repertoires. But for road safety movement and for July Uprising, there was a lot of innovation.
Yes.
The other movements were not that innovative, especially they had road blockade and like occupations. So occupations in Bangladesh, in the Bangladeshi history of social movement, doesn't really work. Because if you occupy a space for too long, your movement, people become annoyed with your movement. So that happened in the Shahbag movement when they blocked a major intersection for 2 months. People grew tired of the movement. So that was kind of retired from the social movement scenario after the Shahbag movement. There were like temporary blockades, and then they would clear out the roads. But in the July Uprising, there was a lot of innovations because they created an activist training kind of scenario that I'm going to explore in my thesis in the part of latent repoliticization. Like they actually prepared for this movement for a long time, for like 2 years or even 3 years or even 4 years. They studied other movements. They studied political revolutions, transformations. So they drew inspiration and education from a lot of different sources, and then they planned this movement so that on every front possible. Number one, and number two, there's a group of students who led the July Uprising. They were from various different backgrounds. There were leftist students, there were right-wing students, there were moderate students. So everyone who came together against the ruling regime. So all of these repertoires, they're attached to specific type of of groups of students. So leftists have a way of doing protest, right? Going confrontational with the police, doing some cultural legwork. So they have that with them. And for the right wing students, you mobilizing the Friday prayer or using religious sentiments to mobilize, that is their forte. So all of these students came together. So they all did whatever they were good at. So it was not just a planned thing that okay, we're going to do this, but sporadic groups of students doing different kind of innovations led to a massive massive accumulation of a lot of different repertoires. So I think that is one of the reasons why you see. But the broadening of the constituency led to the broadening of the innovation in protest, I would say.
Okay, I might just go for one more question before.
Anticipate that the killing of one student would become such a big deal, because as we were talking, I was talking with Michael before about this, like in 2019 a student was beaten to death in a university dormitory for posting something against the government on Facebook, but that did not lead to a massive protest. However, in this time a student was killed, but it was videotaped, right? And that the spreading of that videotape created a transformative event. But the government was kind of arrogant. They thought that we have everything in our control. We control the media, we control the police, we control the military. We would just repress the movement into non-existence. So as they had done so with the road safety movement, as they had appeased the quota reform movement and demobilized it, as they had appeased and demobilized the no-VAT movement, as they kind of quashed the Abrar Fahad movement. So all of the successful appeasement and quashing of the movement made the regime too self-satisfied and too arrogant, and they thought they would never be able to. Nobody would ever be able to take them resign from their power or topple the regime or anything like that. So I think they were learning, the machineries were learning, but the key leadership of the government were too arrogant to see that they were vulnerable to an attack, all-out attack from the youth and the students of the society. Okay. So the ultimate goal is to kind of analyze the previous movements and try to see why the July Uprising was successful while the other movements were not as successful or successful in a different sense. They did not bring about regime change, maybe they didn't want to bring about regime change. The aim of my research is kind of figure out what makes movements successful.